Imagine waking up in a country where the average person has exactly $267 to their name to survive the entire year.
Right. Just survival mode.
Yeah, completely isolated from the global market. There are no imported consumer goods, no international banking. And, you're living in a predominantly agrarian society that has been essentially sealed off from the rest of the world for decades.
Completely cut off.
Exactly. But then you fast forward a single generation, that same average citizen now has the purchasing power of over $20,000, works in a multi-billion-dollar service sector, and carries a smartphone connected to a nationwide gigabit network.
It really is wild when you put it like that.
It is. And today, we are taking a deep dive into this breathtaking, almost impossible macroeconomic leap of Albania.
And it really is one of the most dramatic, multi-dimensional socioeconomic transitions in modern European history. Because when you look at the raw empirical data provided by the World Bank over the past 3 decades, from 1990 to 2023, you aren't just seeing economic growth.
Right.
You're witnessing the fundamental rewiring of a nation's DNA.
And that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are taking a custom-tailored framework that you, our listener, provided to us.
And it is a brilliant framework, by the way.
Oh, it's absolutely a masterclass level academic blueprint. It's completely driven by data, completely stripped of political rhetoric. You basically handed us this diagnostic landscape of Albania's economic, demographic, and institutional reality.
Yeah, a beautifully structured presentation.
And what I love about what you sent us is the specific visual aesthetic. You laid out strict rules for this slide deck. Minimalist, white background, no 3D graphics, just clean academic design.
It forces you to actually look at the numbers.
Exactly. So instead of having a screen in front of us, we are going to build these slides in the theater of the mind for you as we talk. We're going to unpack the friction, the causality, and the sheer human effort required to make these numbers a reality.
Because the numbers themselves are staggering. If we start with the foundational metric of a nation's wealth, which is GDP per capita based on purchasing power parity, or PPP, we see a country that practically woke up in a different economic universe.
Let's visualize that first slide you designed for us, the cover page. It's got this stark white background, and on the left side, there's just a thin, deep blue vertical line acting as an anchor.
Very clean.
Yeah, and in the bottom right corner, there's a map of Albania. But it's just a light gray outline, like 20% opacity, no heavy colors at all, just setting the stage.
And that's up the executive summary on slide 2, right?
Exactly. 3 parallel gray wireframes. Inside each wireframe, there's a core finding highlighted with a small, deep blue circle: economic growth, social progress, and institutional governance.
So let's jump into that first wireframe, the economy. Moving from that $267 baseline in the early transition years to a recent peak of $20,591.
Which is just, it's an exponential leap.
It is.
Let's pause on that, because PPP is a crucial distinction here. We aren't just talking about raw GDP, which can be, distorted by inflation or currency exchange rates.
Right. PPP changes the whole conversation.
Purchasing power parity means we are looking at the actual lived experience, the buying power of the average citizen. A $267 per capita PPP is absolute survival mode.
You aren't buying a car or a television.
No, you are quite literally just trying to secure enough calories to feed your family. So to get to $20,000, you don't achieve that by just planting more crops or working the exact same land a little bit harder.
No, you definitely don't.
So how does a society physically maneuver that kind of increase in purchasing power? In your presentation, slide 3 shows this as a 2-dimensional line chart. Just a thick, deep blue line on a white background, no grid lines.
I love that visualization.
It's so stark. You've got a red dashed circle around the starting point of 267, another red dashed circle around the 20,591 endpoint, and a dashed arrow connecting them that just says plus 66% steady growth, which I know that label is pointing to a specific growth metric you highlighted, even though the raw multiplier is massive.
Well, to answer your question about how a society actually maneuvers that, you hit the nail on the head. You cannot do it through agriculture alone. The transition required an entirely different structural foundation.
It's a complete pivot.
Exactly. The data shows that the value added by agriculture, which was the historical backbone of the Albanian economy, slowly but steadily shrank in its dominance.
While something else took over.
Right. At the exact same time, the service sector didn't just grow, it exploded, eventually generating over $13.1 billion in value.
And we can see that perfectly on slide 4 of your outline. It's this minimalist area chart, just light blue and mid-gray tones. And right at the highest peak of the curve, there's a bold upward arrow with a note that says, explosive service growth, $13.1 billion.
That chart tells the whole story of the modernization.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that, though, because moving from a traditional agrarian society to a $13.1 billion modern service economy sounds great on paper, but the friction of that transition in real life must be immense.
Oh, it's incredibly painful for the people living through it.
Because when we say services, we are talking about telecommunications, international banking, tourism, retail, professional IT services. You don't just like hand a farmer a laptop and say, congratulations, you are now a financial analyst.
Exactly. And this is where the macroeconomic data tells a very human story. Transitioning the economic engine requires a simultaneous, massive overhaul of physical and human infrastructure.
You need entirely new systems.
You need high-speed internet cables instead of tractors. You need a legally sound banking system capable of international wire transfers. You need an entirely new regulatory framework.
And the people living through this transition in the 90s and 2000s, they didn't get to press pause on their lives while the government figured this out.
No, they had to adapt in real time.
It's essentially like swapping out the engine of a car while it's speeding down the highway.
That's a great analogy.
They had to tear out the old traditional agricultural combustion engine and drop in a high-tech digital service motor, all while keeping the wheels moving so people didn't starve.
It is a highly accurate way to look at it, but, that engine swap requires massive capital. You cannot build banking systems, lay fiber optics, or construct modern retail centers without a tremendous amount of upfront funding.
And this brings up a huge logistical question. If your baseline is $267, the country is broke.
Completely.
The domestic tax base is functionally non-existent in terms of modern capital requirements. So where did the money come from to fund the transition phase? Was there an external lifeline keeping the patient alive while the surgery was happening?
There absolutely was, and it was the diaspora. The data on personal remittances tells the story of that lifeline.
Slide 5 in the deck.
Yes. In the early days of this transition, hundreds of thousands of Albanians left the country. They migrated to places like Italy, Greece, Germany, and beyond, seeking immediate labor opportunities.
And they sent cash back home.
Exactly. And at its absolute historical peak, these personal remittances accounted for a staggering 28% of Albania's entire GDP.
Wait, 28%? Over a quarter of the entire national economy was just being mailed in from outside the borders.
Yes, it's an astronomical figure.
That's insane.
From a humanitarian perspective, it was the exact capital injection needed. It kept families afloat, it funded basic local construction, and it sparked early domestic consumption.
Right.
But from a macroeconomic perspective, relying on remittances for 28% of your GDP is a symptom of severe structural weakness.
Because it's not sustainable.
Right. It means your domestic economy is essentially on life support. You are exporting your most capable working-age labor force, and those left behind are living off the checks they send back.
It's like a household where nobody actually has a local career. They just wait for a wealthy uncle in another city to send a monthly allowance.
That's exactly what it is.
It keeps the lights on, it buys the groceries, but it doesn't build long-term self-sustaining wealth. But if I'm an average citizen and my uncle in Italy stops sending me 500 euros a month, I'm panicking.
Of course you are.
Yet, when we look at the recent data, remittances have dropped dramatically to around 8.4% of GDP. And the way our listener visualized this on slide 5 is brilliant. It's a smooth line chart, and at the historical peak of 28%, there's a simple gray circle.
Yeah, drawing the eye right to the peak.
Then a step downward pointing arrow leading down to that 8.4% mark, and the text annotation just says, endogenous economic momentum enhanced. Usually a drop in financial inflows sounds like a crisis. So how did the local economy absorb that shock without leaving families destitute?
This is the beautiful paradox of endogenous economic growth. And endogenous just means internal self-generated strength. That drop to 8.4% is actually one of the most positive indicators in the entire data set.
Really?
Yeah, because the total volume of money in the country didn't shrink. Remember, the overall GDP rocketed up. The percentage of remittances fell because the domestic economy, that $13.1 billion service sector we just talked about, grew so fast that it completely dwarfed the money coming from abroad.
Ah, okay. So the pie got so much bigger that the slice coming from outside looks much smaller, even if the absolute dollar amount of the remittances is still decent.
Precisely. Local businesses finally started outcompeting foreign checks.
That makes total sense.
And the societal impact of this shift cannot be overstated. When a society stops waiting for money from abroad and starts generating it at home, consumer behavior transforms.
Because they have skin in the game locally.
Exactly. People start investing in local businesses because there is finally a reliable local demand. Furthermore, it completely shifts political engagement.
How so?
Think about the incentives. If your entire livelihood comes from a Western Union transfer from Rome, you might not care deeply about local tax policies or zoning laws in Tirana.
Right, because it doesn't affect your bottom line.
But the moment your income relies on your own domestic retail business or a local IT job, suddenly the quality of domestic infrastructure, local tax rates, and regulatory fairness become the most important things in your life. Financial independence drives democratic accountability.
That is a fascinating way to look at it. But this raises another massive hurdle. If you are going to build an endogenous service economy, if you want your people working in banking, healthcare administration, and professional services instead of just waiting for checks from abroad, you need a population that is actually capable of doing those highly complex jobs.
You need human capital.
Right. How did Albania's workforce physically and intellectually catch up to the speed of its new economy? Let's look at slides 7 and 8 from the presentation.
That brings us to what economists call human capital, or HCI. This measures the knowledge, skills, and health that people accumulate throughout their lives, which enables them to realize their potential as productive members of society.
And the data here reveals some truly profound victories, starting with public health, right on slide 7.
Because you simply cannot staff a multi-billion-dollar service economy with a population that is sick.
Let's look at the visual for this. Our listener used a step-down chart here, and piercing right through the descending line is this thick, downward-pointing green arrow. The text just says, public health care victory.
We are talking specifically about mortality rates, right? Like children under 5.
Yes. Historically, the upper bounds of uncertainty for under 5 child mortality in Albania were devastatingly high. At times, well over 63 deaths per 1,000 live births in the early transition years.
Wow.
That is first and foremost a profound human tragedy. But macroeconomically, it's also a massive drain on human capital and societal stability.
Right, the system just can't function. Today, that number has been driven down sharply into the single digits. We see a similarly dramatic plunge in the maternal mortality ratio.
How does a country achieve that kind of rapid health turnaround? Because it can't just be about building a few more hospitals or training more doctors, right? It has to be deeper than that.
It is deeper. Plunging mortality rates are actually a proxy for total infrastructural modernization. If you cross-reference this with other World Bank indicators, the causality becomes clear.
What other indicators?
Well, during this same period, access to reliable electricity approached 100%. Access to clean fuels and technologies for cooking surged from around 36% to over 86%.
Let's connect those dots. Why does cooking fuel matter to the economy? I mean, it sounds so mundane.
Because when you take toxic wood, coal, and biomass smoke out of residential kitchens, where women and children historically spent a significant portion of their time, respiratory diseases collapse.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And when you provide reliable electricity across rural areas, you can suddenly refrigerate vaccines, purify water, and keep clinics open at night. The collapse in mortality is the dividend paid by modernizing the basic physical environment.
That is incredible. So the population is surviving, they are healthier, the infrastructure is holding up. But physical health is only half the human capital equation.
Right, you still need the skills.
Exactly. To work in a modern service economy, you need education. And the literacy data on slide 8 is striking, especially the way it's visualized. Our listener used a minimalist dumbbell plot.
A great choice for comparing two data points.
It really is. It shows the male and female literacy rates, and the two data points are so close together they are almost touching. There's a gray dashed circle drawn around both of them with the label gender gap basically eliminated.
Because adult literacy in Albania has essentially achieved universal status. The data shows the female literacy rate hitting 97.2% and the male rate sitting at 99.1%.
That's practically universal.
It is.
Yeah.
And that tiny margin between the two is arguably one of the most important economic metrics we've discussed so far.
Because in traditional agrarian economies, especially those that were historically isolated, there is almost always a severe gender gap in education. Boys might go to school, while girls are kept home for unpaid agricultural or domestic labor.
Exactly. When a country closes that educational gender gap, they are effectively unlocking the economic potential of 50% of their population.
You double your workforce.
You do. You cannot build a modern, high-functioning service sector if half your citizens are structurally excluded from reading a contract, operating a computer, or managing financial logistics. By nearly erasing the gender gap in literacy, Albania doubled its viable modern workforce.
Okay, so if we take stock of where we are in the data so far, we have a healthy, universally educated workforce. The economy is shifting to high-value services. Domestic wealth is replacing foreign charity. The mortality rates have plummeted.
It sounds like a complete success story.
Honestly, looking at this diagnostic landscape, it feels like they have solved the puzzle. Everything should be smooth sailing from here, right?
I have to slow the momentum here.
Uh-oh.
Because while the quality of the workforce has improved dramatically, the underlying structure of the population hides a looming, unavoidable threat. And it's one of the hardest macroeconomic problems for any nation to solve.
And this is slide 6 in our deck, the demographic challenge. Our listener designed this cold, gray, vertical bar chart. And the last 3 bars, representing the most recent years, are filled in deep blue. There's this large bracket over them that says, over 400,000 elderly, challenges intensifying. What exactly is the threat here?
Demographics. The data points to a rapid, intense aging of the population. The number of people aged 65 and older has surged past 400,000.
For a country of Albania's size, under 3 million people, that is a massive demographic shift.
That's huge.
But wait, didn't we just celebrate people living longer as a massive public health victory? How does a public health victory become a macroeconomic threat?
It becomes a threat because of a concept called the age dependency ratio.
Okay, break that down for me.
This metric calculates the ratio of dependents, meaning people older than 64 or younger than 15, to the active working age population. As the elderly population grows, the financial burden on the active workforce increases.
Because someone has to pay for it all.
Exactly. Someone has to pay for the pensions, someone has to fund the specialized hospitals and the elder care facilities.
And this is where the timeline feels incredibly cruel. Wealthy Western European nations like Germany or France are currently struggling with aging populations, but they had a century of accumulated industrial wealth to build up their pension funds.
They had a massive head start.
Right. Albania is hitting this demographic wall just as it is trying to stabilize its newly minted middle-income economy. How does a country afford a first-world pension system without first-world historical wealth?
That is the defining tension of their current era, and it creates a massive squeeze on the youth. Remember those highly educated young people we just talked about? The ones with 99% literacy. They are entering a highly competitive modern labor market, and youth unemployment has historically been a notable hurdle. So they are caught in a vice. They must secure high-paying modern jobs while simultaneously carrying an increasingly heavy tax burden to support a rapidly aging society.
And I imagine that tax base is further complicated by the history of the labor market. If we go back a few decades to that agrarian economy, a lot of people weren't exactly collecting formal paychecks with tax deductions, right?
Exactly. And this is perfectly illustrated on slide 9.
Oh, right, the horizontal percentage stacked bar chart. Our listener put a solid box around a very specific high-frequency data segment, female self-employed and unpaid family labor, which was once up at 62.6%.
The World Bank employment data highlights this critical historical fragility. Self-employment and unpaid family labor historically made up a very significant portion of female employment. At one point, that percentage of vulnerable employment for women was incredibly high.
Unpaid family labor, meaning women working on the family farm or running the till at a family-owned market, but not drawing a formal taxable salary.
Exactly. They aren't paying into a state pension system, and they aren't receiving formal benefits.
Precisely. Now, while that informal labor has been steadily formalizing as the service sector grows, the legacy of that era remains. If a large segment of your newly elderly population worked informally for decades, they don't have robust retirement savings.
They don't have private pensions.
Which means the state, and by extension the current young workforce, has to absorb the entirety of that cost.
So the economic engine is running faster than ever, but the demographic weight it has to pull is getting heavier by the day.
Right.
To solve this, to make the youth productive enough to carry this massive societal weight, you have to give them tools to work exponentially faster. You need infrastructure that allows a single worker to generate massive value.
Which brings us to slide 10, the digital leapfrog.
Yes. The expansion of telecommunications in Albania is a textbook example of technological leapfrogging.
And the visual here is so striking. It's a spark line. No axes, just the pure shape of the data on a white background. And at the very end of this explosive upward curve, there's a bold blue dot. The text reads, exponential expansion of mobile communications.
In the early 90s, Albania's telecommunications infrastructure was essentially non-existent. The data for mobile cellular subscriptions starts at absolute zero.
Zero.
But then it traces that explosive exponential curve upward, skyrocketing to over 2.7 million users.
Over 2.7 million mobile subscriptions in a country of under 3 million people. That is basically total market saturation.
It is.
Every adult has a phone, and some have two. How did they roll that out so fast without the underlying wealth?
The leapfrog effect happens precisely because they didn't have legacy infrastructure holding them back. Albania didn't have to spend decades and billions of dollars laying heavy, expensive copper landline wires to every remote village in the mountains.
Oh, I see. They just skipped it.
Exactly. They bypassed the 20th century analog phase almost entirely. They jumped straight from zero connectivity to 21st century digital mobile networks via cell towers.
That is incredible. It's like going straight from riding a horse to driving a Tesla, completely skipping the internal combustion engine phase.
That's a perfect way to describe it. And that digital connectivity is the oxygen for the service sector. You cannot have a modern banking sector, you cannot integrate with European IT supply chains, and you cannot build an international tourism industry without ubiquitous high-speed internet and mobile networks.
Right.
But what is truly fascinating is how this digital leap interacts with the country's environmental baseline.
Which brings us to slide 11, carbon emissions and environmental sustainability. It's a light gray area chart. There's a horizontal dashed line representing the global or regional standard, and a downward arrow showing that Albania's emissions are safely below that danger zone.
The numbers show that, excluding land use changes, greenhouse gas emissions have fluctuated between roughly 4.2 and 5.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent.
That line has remained remarkably flat and low, even as the GDP shot up by that massive multiplier we talked about earlier.
And this completely breaks the traditional historical model of economic development. Usually, when a country escapes extreme poverty and its GDP skyrockets, its carbon emissions skyrocket right alongside it.
Because they build factories.
Exactly. The traditional path to wealth think of the Industrial Revolution or the rapid rise of East Asian economies in the 20th century relies on heavy industrialization. Burning coal, building massive steel mills, creating sprawling factories with huge smokestacks.
But because Albania was isolated during that era and then pivoted straight from an agrarian economy to a digital service economy, they bypassed the heavy pollution phase, too.
Yes. A modern service economy fueled by data centers, ecotourism, and mobile commerce has a fundamentally lower carbon footprint than a manufacturing economy. Albania's baseline is naturally green by modern industrial standards.
Let's extrapolate on the strategic value of that for a second. Could this be a massive advantage on the global stage? Because right now, international tech companies and multinational corporations are under immense pressure to meet stringent ESG goals, environmental, social, and governance standards.
They absolutely are.
So if you are a European tech firm looking to invest, a country with high digital connectivity, a highly literate workforce, and naturally low carbon emissions looks like a highly attractive place to put your capital. Albania could market itself as a green digital hub.
That is exactly the strategic positioning modernizing economies aim for. However, attracting that kind of foreign direct investment, or FDI, requires one more critical ingredient.
What's that?
You can have the fastest digital networks, the brightest young workforce, and the lowest carbon emissions in the world. But foreign companies will not bring their billions across your borders if they do not trust the system.
Trust. Which brings us to the hardest, most complex, and historically most stubborn part of any national transition.
Governance and institutions.
The rules of the game. And our listener devoted 2 whole slides to this, slides 12 and 13. When we look at the World Bank indicators for governance, we are looking at 2 specific metrics: the Control of Corruption Index and the Rule of Law Index.
Right. These measure the perception of how public power is exercised, the quality of contract enforcement, property rights, and the reliability of the police and courts.
Let's start with control of corruption on slide 12. It's a line chart crossing the zero axis. There's a very faint red to green gradient in the background to show negative versus positive territory. The index started at a dismal negative 0.99. But over the years, there's a blue arrow tracking the upward trend, ending at a bold circle at negative 0.33. The label says governance environment continuously purifying.
And if we look at the rule of law index on slide 13, it's a scatter plot with a trend line. It started at negative 1.02, which signifies extreme institutional fragility, and there is a clear linear upward arrow showing it has climbed its way to negative 0.16.
Okay, I want to push back on these numbers a bit, or at least play devil's advocate.
Sure.
We've been talking about massive victories, but we have to be brutally honest here. These numbers are still negative. 0 is roughly the global median. A negative number means that absolute institutional strength is still very much a work in progress. Corruption is still a reality. The courts are still finding their modern footing.
Your skepticism is completely warranted. Institutions almost always lag behind economic growth. It is relatively easy to import a cell tower. It is incredibly difficult to change a deeply embedded culture of bureaucratic bribery, or to train an entire generation of impartial judges to enforce complex corporate law.
I like to think of it like a security system for a newly built mansion. The economic growth, the jump in GDP, the mobile phones, the booming tourism sector, that is the beautiful new house.
Right.
But the rule of law is the security system and the property deed. You can build a $13 billion service sector, but if a foreign tech company doesn't trust that your courts will protect their intellectual property, or if they fear their local assets could be seized arbitrarily, they won't even walk through the front door.
Because capital is inherently cowardly.
Exactly. It flees from unpredictable legal systems.
Capital is cowardly, is the perfect way to phrase it. But this is where we have to look at the velocity of the data, not just the absolute position. Yes, the numbers are negative, but the trend line is pointing sharply upward.
It's the momentum that counts.
Exactly. Moving from negative 1.02 to negative 0.16 is a massive systemic improvement. Foreign investors don't just look for perfection, they look for predictable, positive momentum. Are property rights getting more secure year over year?
Yeah.
Yes. Is contract enforcement getting more reliable? Yes.
So the data shows a slow, hard-fought, continuous climb out of institutional vulnerability. It's the final hurdle. Perfecting the rule of law is the key to unlocking full European economic integration. Without it, the economic engine eventually stalls. With it, that $13 billion service sector can double.
Exactly. And this brings us to the synthesis of this entire three-decade journey. If we map out the macroeconomic risks and the strategic outlook, we see a clear logic map of where Albania stands today.
Right. Let's look at slide 14, the macro risks. Our listener designed this as a logical radar chart, just simple gray lines mapping out the 3 points of a triangle. At each vertex, there's a minimalist exclamation point icon.
It's a triangulation of vulnerabilities.
Exactly. Point 1 is the aging population, the immense demographic weight of over 400,000 elderly citizens pressing down on a newly forming pension system. Point 2 is youth employment, ensuring that the highly literate, digitally native youth have access to high-value jobs so they don't emigrate. And point 3 is that final necessary push to clean up institutional corruption and solidify the rule of law to ensure foreign investment flows freely.
Those are the headwinds. But what is the ultimate conclusion of the data?
Let's turn to the final slide, slide 15, the strategic outlook. It's so clean. White background, a large, deep blue quotation mark on the left. On the right, there are 3 minimalist square cards side by side, economy, society, and institutions. Simple, bold keywords, and a little rising line icon in each.
The ultimate conclusion here is that the old playbook is officially closed. The era of surviving on subsistence agriculture, enduring extreme isolation, and relying on 28% of the national GDP to be wired in from expats living abroad, that era is over.
So what is the new playbook?
The new playbook is defined by those 3 pillars. Economically, Albania has successfully transformed into a service-driven, digitally connected, middle-to-high-income economy. Socially, it possesses a highly educated, gender-equal, and healthy human capital base, even as it navigates the burden of its aging demographics.
And institutionally?
Institutionally, it is steadily modernizing its governance and establishing the rule of law required to compete on a global stage. The strategy moving forward requires leveraging that highly educated youth to generate enough high-value economic output to support the elderly, all while demanding cleaner, more transparent governance.
It is an incredible journey. Just to recap the sheer scale of this deep dive, we started in a world where the average person had $267 of purchasing power, a world of heavy agricultural reliance.
Complete survival mode.
And through this incredible data set, we tracked the surge to a $20,000+ service powerhouse. We explored the mechanics of how endogenous local growth replaced the remittance lifeline. We looked at how plugging into the electrical grid drove child mortality down to single digits, and how closing the educational gender gap unlocked half the economy.
It's practically a miracle of modernization.
It really is. We map the leap straight into the mobile digital age while bypassing the carbon-heavy industrial phase, and we watch the slow, grinding, victorious climb toward the rule of law.
It is a testament to human resilience and adaptability, mapped out perfectly through the empirical lens of macroeconomic data.
But before we let you go, we always like to leave you with a final thought. Something that builds on the data we've explored today, but pushes the boundary of the conversation just a little further for you to mull over on your own.
Looking at all this data, a striking dichotomy emerges. When a nation successfully leapfrogs its technology and its economy, moving from traditional agriculture to gigabit internet, its human capital adapts incredibly fast.
Right, they learn to use the tools.
Exactly. People learn to use smartphones, integrate into global supply chains, and work in modern banks in a matter of a few short years. But institutions, the courts, the political culture, the deeply embedded bureaucracies are made of culture.
And culture is stubborn.
Culture changes agonizingly slowly. So, looking at Albania's trajectory, the ultimate question is this. What happens when a country's economic software updates faster than its institutional hardware? Can a society entirely rewrite its economic DNA in a single generation without eventually losing its balance?
That is a fascinating tension to leave on, the race between economic speed and institutional stability. Thank you so much to our listener for providing such an incredibly detailed, data-driven, visually stunning framework for today's deep dive. Unpacking the mechanics behind these numbers was a fantastic way to understand the reality of such a profound national transformation. We hope this gives you exactly the analytical edge you were looking for. Until next time.